Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is pro-Hamas rallies on campuses and in cities across the United States. Stop calling them pro-Palestinian protesters. Stop calling them anti-Israel protesters. Call them what they are. Pro-Hamas. They support those who kill, burn alive, mutilate the bodies of babies, the raping of men and women. These are people who ransacked and occupied campuses across America. The people who rally in support of Mohammed Khalil need to be properly labeled. Supporters of Hamas. Yes, they are also pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel, but that is secondary to the raison d'etre. They are primarily pro-Hamas. The cause that they embrace is unique in history, in the history of U.S. protest movements. Unique because they embrace the murder, kidnapping, dismembering, and raping of innocent Jewish children, as well as the murdering of their parents and grandparents during the Hamas heinous rampage through southern Israel on October 7th, 2023. One can argue the validity of showing support for Palestinians or support for Israel. One can agree to disagree on which side you take, but there is no validity for supporting Hamas. None. Support for mass murder, for brutal kidnapping, for ransoming of dead bodies is inhumane. It is immoral. Celebrating death, dancing around their coffins, presenting the survivors with goodie bags is beyond the pale of acceptable. It is wrong by all standards of morality. Celebrating and embracing these actions, justifying those reprehensible acts, is exactly what these rallies represent. The saddest part is that these Hamas supporters, with their fallacious arguments, have insinuated themselves into the homes of many lovers of Israel. Their parents are stunned, devastated, shocked, as their children, the children they brought up, that they cherish, but they justify the heinous, monstrous actions. They listen as their children defend being pro-Hamas, explaining that Hamas is defending themselves against an oppressive, immoral Israel. How, I've been asked by more than one parent, is it possible that our children have come to embrace the cause of our enemy? How? Deeply hurt by the arguments of their children, the conversations most often devolve into shouting matches. To call those who perpetrated the atrocity on October 7, 2023, pro-Palestinian defenders of Palestinian rights is to whitewash the true Hamas agenda, an agenda which Hamas proclaims publicly. It is to justify Hamas's murderous philosophy. But the response I tell these parents, and all those pained by what is happening all around us, is to bring out the Hamas Charter, a charter which openly calls for the murder of all Jews. In their words, in Hamas's words, the charter reads, "The day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him.'" That's Article 7. This actually comes from the Quran. Then enemies have been scheming for a long time and accumulated huge and influential material wealth. With their money, they took control of the world media. With their money, they stirred revolutions in various parts of the globe. They stood behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we hear about. With their money, they formed secret organizations, such as the Freemasons, Rotary Clubs, and the Lions, which are spreading around the world in order to destroy societies and carry out Zionist interests. They stood behind World War I and formed the League of Nations, through which they could control and rule the world. They were behind World War II, through which they made a huge financial gains. There is no war going on anywhere without them having their finger in it. That's Article 22 from the Hamas Charter. And the Hamas regards itself as the spearhead and the vanguard of the circle of struggle against world Zionism. Islamic groups all over the Arab world should also do the same since they are best equipped for their future role in the fight against the warmongering Jews. That's Article 32. Hamas accepted this charter in 1988. While they revised the charter in 2017, Hamas did not revoke or invalidate their original charter. It still stands as the clearest and most succinct statement of the goals and objectives and ideology of Hamas. This attitude towards the Jew is prevalent everywhere in Hamas. It is Hamas, as evidenced by a typical sermon delivered by Atala Abu al-Sub, former Hamas Minister of Culture. The sermon was aired on Al-Aqsa TV, Hamas TV, April 8, 2011. He said, "Whoever is killed by a Jew receives a reward of 2 martyrs, because the very thing that the Jews did to the prophets was done to him. The Jews are the most despicable and contemptible nation to crawl upon the face of the earth, because they have displayed hostility to Allah. Allah will kill the Jews in the hell of the world to come, just like they killed the believers in the hell of this world. The Jews kill anyone who believes in Allah. They do not want to see any peace whatsoever on earth." The legal question here, as to whether a green card holder or a student visa holder can be deported or embracing terrorism, the ideology, is not our question at all for this discussion. Our discussion is about those who embrace Hamas, the ideas I just presented. Our values embrace the sanctity of life, even in death. Israel's been protecting the dignity of those murdered and those taken hostage by Hamas. It is time for the awful, obscene truth to be known. There can be only one conclusion. Hamas is a death cult. Hamas is a murderous agency that celebrates the brutal murder of Jews. Those who advocate for Hamas need to be called supporters of murderers, not defenders of Palestinian human rights. Coming up, points of view. First up is a column from the Jerusalem Post. It was published on March 14th, 2025, and it was penned by Zina Rachmanlivova. It's entitled, "There is no such thing as a good jihadist. Western media is downplaying HTS's brutality." Opinion, subtitled, "Whether it is HTS in Syria or Hamas in Gaza, these groups are genocidal fundamentalists. There is no such thing as a good jihadist." HTS, the group Zina is referring to, is the de facto leadership of the Syria right now, after ousting the Assad family dictator dynasty. HTS stands for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The group's leader is Ahmed al-Shara. We have spoken about al-Shara and HTS terrorism, as well as al-Shara's changing his name and the U.S. taking off the most wanted terrorist list and rescinding the bounty of his head, dead or alive. That's an interesting story also. Zina's point is well taken. This is how she begins. What we witnessed this past week in Syria has reached new levels of barbarity, perpetrated by Turkey-backed Islamists and jihadists that nobody in the West seems to care. Over 1,000 people were slaughtered by the newly established Syrian security forces in a massacre that bore an uncanny resemblance to the Hamas's atrocities on October 7, 2023 in Israel. The mass executions of Syria's minorities were cruel, degrading, and inhumane. In some footage, Syrian security forces forced their victims to bark like dogs and pledged loyalty to the new regime before executing them. Like Hamas, the jihadists filmed their atrocities and broadcasted them to the world for the world to see. Yet there were no mass protests, no encampments, no petitions, no calls to boycott Syria, nothing. As someone aptly put it, no Jews, no news. Zina now explains that there is no hope for HTS in Syria to become democratic. They are jihadists and murderers. But of course the West was self-deceived, thinking that there is an opportunity for Syria to become democratic, she writes. After the rebels overthrew Bashar al-Assad in December 2024, the new Syrian government, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham leader Ahmed al-Shara, took power. Many of us in Israel were skeptical about what this meant for Syria's minorities, and Israel's security. HTS was not a democratically elected government, but a jihadist faction that originated from Al-Qaeda and seized control by force. Initially, al-Shara and his group sought to convince Western media that they had turned over a new leaf and were working toward a democratic Syria. CNN even conducted an interview with Shara, lending him a platform to rebrand himself. But the illusion shattered this past week when HTS security forces massacred 830 Alawite Syrians in just 48 hours. Now, Western media is downplaying or outright ignoring the brutality of the very jihadists they once painted as moderate and pro-democracy. Even as they butcher their own people, the violence in Syria this weekend erupted when a group of Alawites ambushed Shara's forces, triggering a disproportionate retaliation. Zina explains that the brutality and massacres must not be ignored. It is essential to see HTS for what it is, just like Hezbollah, just like Hamas, just like Iran. And she writes it. The atrocities committed by these jihadists cannot and must not be excused. There is no democracy in Syria. The country remains war-torn, having merely exchanged one tyrannical regime for another. A nation cannot claim democracy when its leader emerges from Al-Qaeda. He may wear a suit, but his past and his future tell a different story. Zina explains that Westerners just do not understand why they cannot conceive of a person who murders infants, like the Bibas children. She writes, "There is a vast disconnect between people in the West and the grim reality of countries ruled by radical jihadists. The average person in a Western democracy cannot comprehend that Hamas terrorists would murder a 9-month-old baby with their bare hands, or that Syrian jihadists would publicly execute a minor on camera. Because they cannot process such evil, they end up sympathizing with it, or even aiding tyrannical jihadists who oppress minorities across the Middle East." Her conclusion is actually interesting, appealing to everyone to understand that the jihadist groups are not ripe for democracy. They are mass murderers, she concludes. Whether it's HTS in Syria or Hamas in Gaza, these groups are genocidal fundamentalists. There is no such thing as a good jihadist. Radical Islamicism brings nothing but chaos and destruction. Hamas, like HTS, seeks the annihilation rather than governance. Gaza lies in ruins because Hamas betrayed its own people for Iranian blood money. Thank you, Zina, for an excellent column. I hope our leaders hear you. Next up is a column by Ira Stoll, published in the Allgemeiner on March 14th. It's entitled, "New York Times Cheerleads for Pro-Hamas Mahmoud Khalil." No subtitle. For a welcome change, it's nice not to give away the entire column in the subtitle. This is how Stoll begins. On March 9th, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement arrested Mahmoud Khalil, a former Columbia University graduate student. Secretary of State Rubio posted on X, quote, "We will be revoking the visas and or green cards of Hamas supporters in America so they can be deported." President Trump himself posted, "ICE proudly apprehended and detained Mahmoud Khalil, a radical foreign pro-Hamas student on the campus of at Columbia University. This is the first arrest of many to come." Anyone who expected straight down the middle impartial coverage of this issue from the New York Times would be disappointed. Instead, the paper's news columns have turned themselves into cheerleaders for Khalil and his supporters, portraying him as a free speech martyr. In the 4.5 days since Khalil's arrest, the Times has published at least 11 articles about it, with credits to no fewer than 13 reporters and 2 opinion columnists. The opinion columns set the tone with hyperbolic alarmism. "This is the greatest threat to free speech since the Red Scare," one headline put it. Stoll demonstrates just how warped the New York Times is in its coverage of this issue. He explains, "What I earlier told you, that the protesters are not pro-Palestinian protesters, but rather pro-Hamas protesters and supporters, pro-terror, pro-murder of Jews. That's what we're talking about here. The New York Times, however, sees it differently, and this is how Stoll writes. The news articles read pretty much the same. One piece was by Eliza Shapiro, who last attracted notice for a flawed investigative series that targeted Orthodox Jewish schools in New York. Shapiro's latest article included this passage. The Columbia Jewish Alumni Association, which has been calling for aggressive action against pro-Palestinian demonstrators, praised Mr. Khalil's detention in a series of social media posts, calling Mr. Khalil without evidence, a ringleader of the chaos at Columbia. These Columbia protesters are not pro-Palestinian. They are anti-Israel, pro-terrorism, and pro-Hamas. Likewise, it is loaded to say the Columbia Jewish Alumni Association has been calling for aggressive action against the students who have been disrupting campus activities, including classes. The Jewish alumni have been calling for defensive action to protect Jewish and Israeli students from the violent assaults, harassment, and other social ostracism that has interfered with their education. Stoll takes issue of the question without evidence. He leaves out the most important fact that Khalil was actually the liaison between the protesters and Columbia, but that's a different issue. He has another argument that he gives. Khalil was the de facto leader of the protests. In the same sentence, without evidence, is such garbage, a classic tell of the time's aggression towards whomever the phrase is applied to. The Senate Judiciary Committee, Republicans offered up evidence, including a New York Magazine article describing Khalil as a lead negotiator for Columbia's University Apartheid Divest, a group that has called for total eradication of Western civilization. And what the New York Times itself, in a brief moment of lucidity, acknowledged in an October 24th headline, pro-Palestinian group of Columbia now backs armed resistance by Hamas. Stoll concludes by challenging the New York Times and Columbia. He asserts that the real cause for them is not free speech at all. It is a full-throated support for, you guessed it, Hamas. Not the Palestinians, Hamas. He writes, Columbia gives out Pulitzer Prizes, which are key to career advancement at the New York Times. Maybe the Times is hoping for a Pulitzer for its all-hands-on-deck defense of free speech, Martyr Mahmoud Khalil. The free speech aspect of the issue seems somehow less salient to the Times newsroom when the Israel haters at Columbia were disrupting the class of an Israeli professor, preventing him from speaking. It's almost enough to make a reader wonder whether the Times' cause is really free speech as a universally applied principle, or if what they really dug in committedly in favor of its ability of Columbia students and graduates to cheer on Hamas without any significant adverse consequences. Great column by Albert Stoll, just excellent. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I'm going to show you 6 cartoons and 1 meme today. Once again, no headlines. In this cartoon, Trump and the US is controlling an Israeli tractor which is scooping Palestinians off their land. It is a terrible portrayal. Awful. The cartoon does not even identify Gaza. It's all Palestinians. This cartoon is just way out of line. This next cartoon is also just terrible and awful. Trump and Bibi are holding a sign which reads, Gaza Takeover Plan. But the sign is in the image of the horrific Nazi Auschwitz sign, Arbeit macht frei, work which will set you free, set as an awful joke by the Nazis. And the helicopters moving the buildings, which are unquestionably the entrance to the massive death camp Birkenau, also known as Auschwitz II. Again, this is totally out of line, just awful. Next up is a cartoon similar to many that we've seen in the past. Trump and Bibi are on the beach of Gaza La Playa, and the sign reads, Forbidden for Palestinians. This, of course, is reminiscent of the signs in clubs, no Jews, no dogs. Those were the signs. This next cartoon is very disturbing. Israelis are running and Palestinians are running back to an Israeli soldier and to a flag, and Palestinians are running back to Palestinian and the Palestinian flag, the person with a gun. On both sides are tombstones, one with stars of David on the stones and the other with crescent moons on the stones. This next cartoon is of Gaza, a mound of destruction. On top are two Hamas terrorists planting a Palestinian flag, and one shouts out, "We have won." This is unfortunately how Hamas sees it. As long as one terrorist is still there fighting, Hamas thinks that they have won, that they have not been defeated. This next meme is funny. Ilan Omar says, "In my country, I am forced to keep my mouth shut." Then she says, "Here I am free to talk trash about this country in hopes that I can change it to a country where I am forced to keep my mouth shut." Very insightful and unfortunately very true. Finally, a terrorist in Gaza looks in his closet and asks, "What should I wear today? A press uniform? A medical uniform? A Palestinian uniform?" That is so very true and so very funny. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Senior diplomats from Iran, Russia, and China gathered in Beijing for talks on Tehran's nuclear issues. Chinese state broadcaster CCTV reported that days after the Iranians rejected the U.S., quote, orders to resume dialogue over the Iranian nuclear program. In 2015, Iran reached a deal with the United States, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany, and agreed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for lifting international sanctions. But in 2018, Donald Trump, a year into his first term at the White House, pulled out of the pact. Families of hostages, along with hundreds of other people, held a Friday dinner at a protest site near IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv, calling for the return of all 59 hostages all at once. Adi Angrest, sister of hostage Matan Angrest, said, "My brother is alive but injured. You can see his broken nose and paralyzed hand. In 10 minutes he might no longer be with us." Vicky Cohen, the mother of hostage Nimrod Cohen, added, "As a mother, I also want to get Nimrod back, hug him, and tell him I love him, like other mothers. But I don't know when Nimrod will return." Former hostage Agam Berger was released from the hospital on Friday. She was greeted by hundreds of supporters outside her home in Cholon. Crowds waved Israeli flags and held signs reading, "Agam, welcome home." She described her emotional return home as, "It's crazy, my heart is racing." She told reporters and well-wishers how happy she was to be at home finally. Security forces in the West Bank eliminated 3 terrorists, detained over 100 wanted suspects, and seized dozens of weapons during a counter-terrorism operation. The IDF spokesperson unit reported that, quote, "as part of an ongoing counter-terrorism operation in northern Samaria, the forces conducted targeted raids in areas of Araba and Kabatia," the military added. The U.S. and Israel have contacted officials from 3 East African countries to discuss the territories for resettling Palestinians from Gaza, the Associated Press reported, citing U.S. and Israeli officials. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. This video is an interview from Israeli TV channel 12. Ilana Dayan interviews Eli Sharabi about his experience as a hostage in the tunnels for 491 days. It's just over 5 minutes. It is extremely powerful. The longer interview is 18 minutes. President Trump watched it and immediately invited Sharabi to the White House.
ב3 הימים הראשונים אני כפות בידיים מאחורה, כפות ברגליים עם חבלים שקוראים לי את הבשר, וקצת אוכל, קצת מים ביום. אני זוכר שאני לא מצליח להירדם מהכאבים, כי גם החבלים כבר בתוך הבשר, וכל תנועה אתה רוצה לצרוח, וגם אתה כפות עם ידיים מאחורה, אז הכתפיים נורא נורא כואבות, ושום תנוחה לא מספיק טובה, ואז יש רגעים שאתה פשוט מתעלף. אתה מתעלף, אתה מאבד את ההכרה, מתעורר אחרי 2-3, והכאבים ממשיכים, ואני מתחנן בפניהם שיורידו שיעבירו לפחות את הקשירה של הידיים קדימה, ואז אני אהיה רגוע, הכל יהיה בסדר. והם לא מסכימים, אבל אחרי 3 ימים מורידים לנו את החבלים.
רק לפני רגע היית חבר קיבוץ, עם אישה ו2 בנות, עם עבודה נהדרת, עם חיים נפלאים, ופתאום אתה זרוק בעזה, כפות ידיים ורגליים.
כן.
אתה שואל את עצמך, רגע, מה נהיה?
אני לא עסוק בזה, כי אני מבין כבר את הסיטואציה, ואני יודע שלהתבוסס בתוך סיטואציה לא מקדמת אותי לשום מקום. אתה מנהל את ההישרדות שלך כל הזמן ומחפש פתרונות כל הזמן. כואב לך, אתה מחפש שלא יכאב לך. אתה רעב, אתה מחפש לא להיות רעב. אתה מבין שאין שליטה, שאתה נתון בידי אחרים, עדיין בתוך הכאוס הזה, אתה מנסה קצת לקחת את השליטה.
וזה יוצר שליטה בתוך האין שליטה.
בדיוק, כל הזמן.
ולמה החלטת להתראיין, אלי?
פשוט באמת אסור להשאיר אף אחד שם מאחור. כל דקה, אני זוכר כל דקה במנהרה, שאנחנו אומרים אולי היום. נשאר שם ילד שפגשתי לפני 1 וחודשיים, אחרי 50 יום בעזה. אלון אוהל. והוא נכנס לי ללב, מבחינתי אימצתי אותו מהרגע הראשון, תמכנו אחד בשני, 24/7 ביחד. כל דבר אני יודע עליו, על המשפחה שלו, כל תאריך, כל תחביב של אחותו, של אחיו, של ההורים שלו, הכל אני יודע. איך אפשר להשאיר אותו מאחור?
ואתה יודע שהוא בעצם עכשיו אחרון במנהרה הזו.
אחרון. זה נורא קשה להישאר לבד. כשהיינו עוד 4, עוד זה נותן לך כוח. יש לך עם מי לדבר, יש לך עם מי לקום בבוקר ועם מי לישון בלילה.
אז מנקודת מבטו של אלון הייתם 4, 2 שוחררו, אתה ואור, ואז שוחרר אליה בשבת שעברה.
אני לא יכול לדמיין את הרגע הזה. לא יכול לדמיין. ביום שאני עוזב, המחבלים קוראים אותי ממנו, הוא פשוט מסרב לעזוב, תפס אותי. רגע מאוד קשה.
הוא אמר משהו?
הוא אמר שהוא שמח בשבילי. הבטחתי לו שאני לא אעזוב אותו שם, שאני אלחם עליו. הבטחתי לו את זה. אמרתי לו שזה עניין של ימים, ממש.
אז בעצם בשבילו אתה פה.
לגמרי. בשבילו עוד חטופים אחרים.
Very powerful. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.